Chapter 1275. Last resort. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. Granted, there was not much to these preparations. Sonny and Nephi's were in a desperate situation, and they could only escape it by resorting to desperate means. This was going to be it. They were either going to live or die. Sonny looked at the weathered surface of the black turtle's shell as they walked to the shore. The black rock, the green moss, the deep fissures with murky water glistening in some of them. He had spent the first month of the nightmare here. It was a harrowing place, or rather, it was supposed to be harrowing. But strangely, all he could remember about the dark island were happy memories. Training with Nephi's until sweat covered their bodies and a pleasant fatigue settled in their muscles. Laying on the moss and staring at the dreamlike sky, unbothered by the movements of the world. Eating delicious meals and drinking cool, sweet water. Bathing in the warmth of a campfire as they talked to each other, surrounded by darkness. All of that was coming to an end. It already had. He was reluctant to let go of this harrowing paradise. But there was no other choice. Maybe I truly am mad. Sonny had entered the nightmare utterly crushed. From Falcon Scott to the Battle of the Black Skull, he had tasted nothing but bitter failure. He had wished to be strong. He had made this wish come true, only to find out that it was of no use in the end. As if to mock him, fate had obliterated everything. However, somehow, he had truly been content on the dark island, sailing through a river of unholy blood on the corpse of a dreadful monster being pulled into the past by the current. He had been happy on that journey, and happier still to share it with someone he was fond of so much. He had been having fun in the depths of a nightmare. So what if I'm mad? He would need madness to survive today. The three of them, Sonny and Nephi's and Saint, reached the slope of the island. Below them, the great river was flowing endlessly, bleak because of the encroaching night. The darkest hour, the brief time after the suns had already plunged into the river, but before the vast expanse of clear water started to glow with soft radiance, was swiftly approaching. Sonny took a deep breath. Calm down, you've prepared for this, you've been preparing this whole time. Indeed, Sonny had not spent the whole month simply relaxing and spending idle time with Nephi's. He had always known that this unexpected respite was not meant to last, and so he had been studying the azure serpent. By now, Sonny knew the mad beast much better than he knew most people. He had learned everything about it, how the serpent fought, how the serpent thought. What emotions guided it, what dark passion burned in its vile, corrupted soul. He also learned how the creature's colossal body moved and worked, down to the smallest detail, as well as how the great river serpent commanded water to turn it into a weapon. In that regard, Sonny's experience fighting side by side with the scions of the House of Night had been of great help. After coming to learn all these things, Sonny knew, for a fact, that he would never be able to defeat the azure serpent in a battle. But that was if the azure serpent was healthy and whole. It was not anymore. The great beast had been ravaged by the battles with the dark butterfly, the harrowing assaults of the krill swarms, and the insidious attacks of the marauding abominations. Its flesh was shredded and frayed, its strength was exhausted, and its mind was clouded by rampant madness. So maybe, just maybe, Sonny stood a chance of emerging victorious from the fight. If he won, they would have to leave the dark island immediately and never look back. Otherwise, the monstrous butterfly was going to descend from the dark sky, notice them, and devour them. If he lost, he would die. At least he would die first, turning the words the sin of Solace had whispered once into a lie. I'm ready. With a sigh, Sonny turned to Nephi's and offered her a faint smile. He lingered for a few moments, then said evenly, "The next one is on you." She nodded seriously, completely missing the humorous undertone. "Of course." Sonny shook his head, then took her hand, transferring the essence pearl from his soul into hers. "I was joking, you know." Nephi's lingered for a moment. Suddenly, she gripped his hand tighter and looked him straight in the eyes. "I wasn't." He held her gaze for several long, poignant seconds before freeing his hand with a sigh. Then, Sunny glanced at Saint. "You know what to do." The graceful knight raised her bow with indifferent grace. She had to play an important part in the battle. 2 Nephis might not have been able to augment her with the white flames, but Saint had been wearing the stifled scream for an entire month. Better yet, just as Sunny had thought, sailing on the great river had a strange effect on the transcendent charm. By now, the enhancement it gifted to the taciturn shadow was much greater than it was supposed to be. Even without the augmentation of the shadow flame, she was frighteningly powerful. Finally, Sunny looked back at Nephis. "Do it." He felt the purifying warmth flowing into his body and soul, strengthening both. At the same time, all 5 of his shadows wrapped themselves around him. In an instant, Sunny felt strong enough to crush the black rocks with his bare fists and shake the entire world with his steps. Turning to the great river, he took a deep breath and whispered, "Lost from light, remember, this is your name." Then he opened the gate of the shadow lantern and allowed a flood of shadows to flow out of it, drowning the slopes of the island. They flowed down like an avalanche of darkness, eventually touching the water. Sunny closed his eyes and dissolved into the shadows. In the next moment, the shadows moved, and something tore free from their dark embrace. A giant serpent with scales as black as onyx manifested itself from the darkness and dove into the water with a deafening roar. Sunny was ready for battle. Now he wasn't Sunny anymore. He was a mighty serpent, clad in an armor of onyx scales, with fangs as sharp as diamonds and enough fury to incinerate the world. But that was not enough. Following his wrathful roar, the shell hiding below his scales turned into the adamantine mantle. A fearsome obsidian armor encased his flexible body, light as a feather, and crafted so intricately as not to restrict his movement in any way. The water exploded into the air when he dove into the depths that belonged to him, and him alone. "Old snake!" The call escaped his monstrous maw, turned into a senseless roar. What he had done was simple, but also indescribably hard. He had dove deeper into shadow dance than ever before, mirroring both the mind and the physique of a nightmare creature. He had not been sure that it would be possible until the last moment, but his meticulous preparation paid off. It was do or die, nothing less. He had spent countless hours observing the azure serpent and learning everything there was to learn about it. Then, he dissolved into the shadows and manifested himself back into a tangible form. Finally, he summoned the dead shadow of the black turtle, which he had lured into the lantern, to form a mighty shell around his fragile incarnation. But for the first time, the shape of his shell was not that of the shadow fiend. Instead, it was the shape of a monstrous river serpent, the shape of the mad beast whom he feared, admired, and wanted to kill. Of course, this shadow shell could not compare to the real thing. He was only an ascended after all, while the azure serpent was a great beast. It was weaker, less resilient, and smaller, maybe a quarter of the size of the actual abomination. However, it was suffused with the power of both shadows and soul flame, granting it power well beyond the limits of what an ascended could possess. It was also protected by the mantle and made to reign the depths. Only, there was another challenging his reign. A maddening fury consumed his mind, and he shot forward through the water like a black spear. He could feel it, the scent of blood spilling from the mangled body of the older, stronger beast. So what if it was older? So what if it was stronger? It would be torn apart by his fangs anyway. The azure serpent had felt him, too. He sensed a vast shadow rising from below to meet him. It was brimming with harrowing power and terrifying madness. But he was not afraid. He didn't know how to be afraid. All he knew was wrath and bloodlust. The two of them, a colossal serpent covered in beautiful azure scales, and a smaller serpent encased in obsidian armor, wreathed in shadows and blinding white radiance, collided in the water, causing gargantuan waves to rise on the surface of the great river. Their first collision would have been his last if he had not twisted his body at the last moment, evading the azure serpent's deadly maw and diving under its belly. He had to remind himself that he was lost from light. He was not a mindless nightmare creature. He was not a beast. He was cunning, resourceful, and skilled. He possessed the honed battle sense of a masterful warrior and the powerful soul of a tyrant. It was a strange thing to both believe that he was a serpent with all his heart and know that he was something else. Losing himself in the dance was just too easy, but his true name was like a beacon that guided him home. He, Sonny, understood that he had to remember himself if he wanted to survive. His current form was immensely powerful, no less powerful than a saint's transcendent form would have been, perhaps. He could feel the barriers that had been preventing him from mastering the fourth step of shadow dance breaking. He could feel his boundless, bestial strength. But in front of the azure serpent, that strength was almost laughable. Despite the terrible wounds covering the body of the great beast, it was still infinitely more powerful than his. Which was why he had to be devious, cunning, and sober if he wanted to kill his enemy. He had to be deranged and overcome by fury too. He had to guide his mad fury and sharpen it into a cold and merciless blade. Sonny twisted his serpentine body, dodging the maw of the ancient abomination, and sunk his fangs into an open wound on the azure serpent's neck. It was only for a moment, though, giving up on tearing out a chunk of flesh. He let go and darted upward a split second later. It was just in time, because the Leviathan's jaws snapped closed just a meter behind him in the next moment. The two of them clashed furiously as they ascended from the depths. The azure serpent was much larger, more powerful, and terrifyingly domineering. The black serpent was smaller and more nimble, circling around the dreadful beast and delivering vicious bites one after another. However, even without being caught in the Leviathan's jaws, Sonny was suffering tremendous harm. As their bodies brushed against each other, a vast stretch of the mantle cracked and shattered. The shadows below rippled, the internal structure of the shell twisting and breaking apart. The violent currents created by the passing of the azure serpent's body were slowing him down, and his dark flesh was sliced open by the creature's dorsal fin. His shell was bleeding shadows. His essence was being burned. His mind was drowning in pain and derangement. More. Despite knowing that it would cost him his life, Sonny felt compelled to bite into the enemy's flesh and never let go, to hurt the foe as much as he could, even if it meant death. To rip apart, to devour, to destroy. Instead, he continued to dodge the attacks of the azure serpent with clarity and skill, all the while attacking with hatred and fury when he could. And all along, he was leading the great beast upward. Finally, they broke the surface and clashed again above the water. The suns were gone, and the river had not started glowing yet. The shaking world was dark. With a stifled roar, Sonny dodged the fangs of the azure serpent and tried to bite into an open wound on its mangled body, where white bone could be seen. However, before he could, the mad beast's tail crashed into him like an obliterating ram, sending fragments of the mantle flying through the air and a blinding flash of pain piercing in his soul. Arg! Sonny fell heavily into the water, and a tall fountain of white foam rose into the sky. The azure serpent let out a demented growl and lunged at him, aiming to bite the hateful worm in half. Before he could, however, two arrows, one black, one white, fell from the darkness and pierced its flesh. Saint and Nephi's had joined the battle. Sonny had suffered to lure the azure serpent to the surface, But there was a good reason to guide the mad beast there. Two reasons, even Saint and Nephi's. Although neither of them were as capable of fighting the abomination in the water as Sonny was, they could still play an important role in the battle. It was just that he had to create an opportunity for them to do so. And he had. As Sonny was convulsing from pain, two arrows struck the raging Leviathan. One was entirely black, as if forged out of pure darkness, which it was, augmented both by her mantle of darkness and blade of darkness abilities, as well as the enhancement of the stifled scream. Saint's arrow pierced the azure serpent's one remaining eye. It was the darkest hour of the night, and so her strength was at its peak. More than that, this first shot she sent was empowered by the dreadful destructiveness of the Death Dealer enchantment, and so it delivered the most damage. And yet, the giant eye of the ancient Leviathan still wasn't destroyed. It was only damaged, becoming painted red, which made the mad beast look even more menacing. Sonny had put a lot of hope into this first salvo, but he was left disappointed. It didn't matter, though. During their violent ascent, he had been strategically trying to place himself on the side of the azure serpent where it was blind. However, there was no advantage to be gained there. Whatever senses the enemy was using to perceive his movements were perfect and precise, even without vision. His plan to blind the mad beast had been meaningless from the start. The second arrow was white. Its impact was not nearly as forceful as that of the first arrow, but it was still quite ferocious. Nephi's had always used a sword, but it was simply a preference. As a legacy, she had been trained in the use of all kinds of weapons, and that certainly included bows. There was a powerful memory longbow in her sole arsenal, crafted by the Forgemasters of Valor, and several enchanted arrows as well. But even then, the white arrow barely managed to pierce the flesh of the azure serpent despite sliding faithfully into an already existing wound, where the azure scales and the tough skin of the Leviathan had already been torn open by the dark butterfly. The damage was negligible. That was just as expected, too. Neph's goal was not to wound the great beast with her arrows. Instead, it was to deliver the black venom from the overflowing bitter cusp into its flesh. She coated the arrowheads with the toxin before each shot. One dose of the black venom was not going to affect the azure serpent much, but 10, 20, or 30 could weaken it, perhaps. Sonny did not expect Saint and Nephi's to bring the mad beast down. After all 5 shadows and all the soul flame were augmenting him, and him alone. He was the only one with the ability to truly damage the abomination. But they had to harass and weaken it so that he could deliver a fatal strike. It seemed to be working. The 2 arrows had not seriously wounded the azure serpent, but they had distracted it for a second. That second was enough for Sonny to shake off the terrible pain of having his soul damaged and slightly repair his shell. Letting out a wrathful hiss, he shot forward and bit into the side of the Leviathan. Even though the shadow shell had no taste buds, he could swear that he sensed the salty taste of blood on his tongue. That taste drove him into a frenzy. "Devour, I am going to devour you, I am going to rip you apart." Forgetting the pain, forgetting the suffering, Sonny pressed his mighty jaws together in an attempt to savage and mutilate his enemy. It was only through an incredible effort that he forced himself to maintain control and let go, dashing aside just in time to avoid being trapped and crushed in the coils of the azure serpent's colossal body. A drop of cold fear fell into the incinerating inferno of his fury. This is dangerous. Battling a great beast was already perilous enough, but the act of assuming the shape and form of a nightmare creature, of diving into its mind and heart so deeply, was in and of itself a great danger. Sonny had used shadow dance to read abominations before, but he had never tried to manifest himself into one of them. It was too easy to get lost in that state, maybe forever. Even the true name was not a panacea. He also had to maintain his sense of self, while simultaneously denying it. Maybe this was the fourth step of shadow dance, the ability to preserve his identity while becoming truly formless in mind, body, and soul, and thus infinitely malleable, like all shadows were. As Sunny nimbly dodged the attacks of the azure serpent and lashed out with his sharp fangs and crushing tail, more arrows fell from the darkness. Saint was not using Death Dealer anymore. Instead, trying to weigh the Leviathan down with the help of Burden of Peace, Nephi's was continuing to poison the great beast with the toxin of the bitter cusp. However, the abomination had quickly grown impatient with their harassment. Its movements changed slightly, and the next time the two shot their bows, a tall wave suddenly rose, washing the arrows away. That gave Sunny an opportunity to deliver a vicious blow, however. Coiling himself around a mangled span of the azure serpent's body, he slithered forward. His sharp dorsal fin bit into the mad beast's flesh, shredding it like a saw. The soft glow of the brightening water was suddenly painted in a crimson hue. "Die, die, die, I'm going to kill you." The azure serpent growled and lunged at him, madness burning in its bleeding eye. It was probably thinking the same. The great river was foaming and seething, gargantuan waves rising from its softly glowing expanse to crash into the weathered slopes of the crumbling island. Two dark silhouettes, one colossal, the other merely giant, were moving through the raging water, intertwined in a murderous battle. Sunny had been driven mad by pain and bloodlust. He lost count of the number of blows his obsidian, serpentine body had endured. He also did not know how many times he retaliated, biting the flesh and breaking the scales of the azure serpent. His mantle was in shambles, the living stone failing miserably to keep up with the barrage of devastating attacks he had to endure. The fearsome onyx armor was cracked and shattered, revealing the glossy black scales beneath. Many of its segments were entirely destroyed. The shadow shell that it was encasing had been shredded and ravaged as well. Giant wounds were gaping on it, bleeding shadows. He had been able to repair some of the damage at first, but having the means to do something like that, it seemed so distant now. There was one thing that filled Sunny with dark glee, though. It was that the azure serpent looked no better than him. The body of the great beast had already been grotesquely mangled before their battle, and now it was in an even worse state. The wounds that had closed were reopened. The wounds that had been opened were now wider and more harrowing, with crimson blood flowing out of them into the radiant water. Dozens of arrows were sticking out of the abomination's scarlet flesh. Some of them weighed it down, some sent a deadly toxin circulating through its bloodstream. But the azure serpent's eyes still burned with the same madness. "Good, good, don't you give up on me, old snake." Sunny wanted to kill the hateful beast, but he didn't want that death to be swift. No, he wanted his enemy's agony to last forever. He wanted to tear its flesh with his fangs forever, feel the shudders of pain pulsing through its body forever, hear its pained cries forever. Control yourself. Snapping out of the consuming madness, he reminded himself of his goal. He needed to kill the azure serpent as fast as possible, not only because his essence was not limitless, but also because the chances of him being killed by the great beast were much higher than the other way around. If there was the smallest chance, he had to take it. It was just that there were no chances. Still, there were none. The mad beast was still in full control of both itself and the battlefield. The water flowed and twisted to aid it and constrain Sunny, as if obediently following the ancient serpent's commands. Even with its body looking like that of a battered corpse and its mind flooded with pain, the azure serpent remained fixated on the solitary goal of destroying its opponent with a truly insane level of focus. But Sunny could feel his mind growing muddled and his reason wavering. "Oh, I can't go on much longer." For the first time since he had assumed the shape of the onyx serpent, the cold realization that defeat was possible entered his consciousness. The thought was so incongruous with the essence of his monstrous form that the shadow shell almost came undone. He held on to his maddening fury and pushed the thoughts of defeat away. Defeat was not possible. Such a thing did not exist. He would never lose. He would not lose again. That last thought was slightly strange, as if it was not his own. Grinding his fangs, Sonny pushed his enormous body through the hostile water, aiming to ram the side of the twisting Leviathan. He knew that the battle had already turned in his enemy's favor, so he needed to do something to balance the scales. But what? The onyx serpent raged as it burned with the mad desire to destroy his enemy. However, Sonny was also calm and cool-headed. What advantages did he have that the great beast did not possess? Both of them were already half dead. He had to kill the enemy, but being killed by the enemy seemed inevitable instead. So then, the two outcomes were not necessarily mutually exclusive. Being killed did not directly stand in the way of achieving his goal. It was only the timing of his death that was the issue. Sonny was filled with an indescribable, furious determination to slay the azure serpent. Nothing mattered in front of this hatred and this consuming need, least of all death. It would be all worth it if he could just feel the life leaving his enemy's bleeding body. Mutual destruction. Yes, he liked it. He liked it a lot. This was the advantage he so desperately needed. Dangerous flames ignited in Sonny's onyx eyes as he twisted his long neck and glared at the reeling serpent. The great beast must have been growing weaker. As well, his attacks and the arrows of his companions were slowly grinding down its boundless endurance. The abomination had been a split second too late and failed to evade being rammed by Sonny's serpentine head, which finally gave him the chance. First, the water. The water had been constraining Sonny, and so he had to wrestle the control of it from the azure serpent first. With his understanding of the great beast and the experience of watching Neve and Bloodwave fight, he could achieve dominance for a few moments at least. Coiling his mighty body like a spring, Sonny shot forward with incredible speed. He moved it in a specific way, forcing a powerful current to rush outward and collide with the opposing one, which had been created by the ancient Leviathan. A great whirlpool appeared where the two currents collided, and he tore through it, unopposed. Second, the target. The target was the azure serpent's titanic spine. Sonny had to sever it no matter what. Usually, the spine would have been protected by layers of impenetrable muscle, a layer of impervious skin, and a dreadful armor of indestructible scales. But the mad beast had been mangled and mutilated by the long weeks of warding off marauding abominations and the eerily monstrous butterfly. Large chunks of its flesh were missing, revealing bone. At a particular spot just below its head, a long span of the spine was revealed, too. That was a good target to choose, especially because the abomination would not be able to use its jaws to defend it. And lastly, the advantage. Sonny did indeed possess an advantage in the battle of mutual destruction. It was because the azure serpent was made of flesh, while he was made of shadows. If he sustained too much damage, the shadow shell was going to fall apart, but his incarnation, which was small and hidden in its depths, could survive. It was just a matter of luck. Either he would be destroyed along with the shell, or get lucky and remain alive. But regardless of the outcome, the hateful Leviathan would die. I am fine with that. Growling viciously, the black serpent shot through the shining waters of the great river, and, discarding all pretenses of defense, closed his jaws on the great beast's spine. Sonny bit into the spine of the azure serpent, igniting what little strength he had left into a violent and furious blaze. Billowing, shadows and flame rose from his onyx scales and wreathed him like a burial shroud. His eyes shone with mad, morbid, murderous malice and chillingly cold killing intent. His jaw pressed down with enough force to shatter mountains. But the spine of a great beast was much stronger than a mountain chain. It resisted his obsidian fangs, refusing to be broken, cracked, or even scratched. Die, die. Drowning in fury, Sonny put all of his resolve, all of his hatred, and all of his desire into crushing the indestructible bone. He violently jerked his head left and right, gnawing on the spine like a rabid dog. If he could not bite through it, he would saw through it. If he could not saw through it, he would grind it down. The azure serpent was going to die, no matter what. It was already half dead anyway. However, so was Sonny. He sensed the gargantuan body of the ancient Leviathan moving, and coldly refused to pay it any attention. It did not matter how the mad beast would try to destroy him, or if it would succeed. Sonny had already discarded his survival instinct. The mad beast could not reach him with its harrowing maw, which meant that it was not going to be able to kill him instantly. That was all he needed to know. As his fangs scraped against the spine of the azure serpent in a frenzy, the abomination's mangled body rose and ensnared Sonny like a crushing vice. Once he was caught in the coils, there would be no escape, he knew it, but he did not care. All he cared about was the feeling of a thin, shallow crack finally appearing under one of his fangs. The Leviathan's spine was giving. Die. As dark glee washed over his heart, the coils tensed, crushing his ravaged shell. The strength contained within them was unlike anything Sonny had experienced before. It was truly and utterly harrowing. Pressing down with harrowing strength, the azure serpent turned the marble carapace of the mantle into stone dust. The serpentine body beneath it was instantly broken, the onyx scales shattering, sharp edges of broken bones piercing the skin and protruding from the horrid wounds. There was blinding pain, but Sonny did not care. More cracks appeared on the abomination's spine now, spreading and merging with each other, and he could feel the giant body of his enemy twitching in pain. He could also feel fragments of bone sinking beneath his fangs. Instead of struggling to save himself, Sonny ferociously bit down on the damaged spine of the Leviathan and persisted in his frenzied attempts to break and mutilate it. Let's see which one of us dies first, old snake, as long as you die first. I don't mind dying second. The dorsal fin of the great beast effortlessly cut into his shell, slicing it open like a saw. Instead of blood, darkness flowed out of the vivisected serpent, only to dissolve and disappear in the soft radiance of the glowing water. Sonny pressed his jaws together in all-consuming fury, and finally felt the bone crumble beneath his bite. Will my incarnation be destroyed, or won't it? Not that it mattered too much. Killing the enemy was the only thing that mattered. There was nothing else. A strange sound that was half a deranged roar and half a wail of agony escaped from his maw. His jaws started to slowly move toward each other. At the same time, the damage his body had received was nearing the level of being catastrophic. By all accounts, his shell should have already come undone, but Sonny had submerged so deeply into the sensation of being a serpent that his absolute belief held it together still. He felt the shadows part before the sharp blade of the Leviathan's fin, opening a straight path to the tiny incarnation hidden within them. Death was swiftly approaching. But at the same time, he felt the spine of the azure serpent shattering as his fangs sank into the sweet marrow. The mad beast convulsed and let out a roar of blind agony. However, just like Sonny, it did not know surrender. It only had murder on its mind, and so, the vice of its coils only grew stronger, crushing and slicing the hateful worm with unquenchable wrath. It was only a matter of moments now, before Sonny's defenseless shadow form would be destroyed. Death. He did not know if he had called upon his enemy's death or greeted his own. For a split second, the shadow flame billowing from his mangled body ignited with startling intensity. In Sonny's mind, everything disappeared. The only thing that remained was an imperative resolve to kill the enemy. His jaw snapped shut with a deafening clap. In the next moment, there was nothing but pain. Sonny lost his sight, his hearing, his smell, his sense of touch, even shadow sense was gone, leaving him in an empty abyss where the only thing that existed was agony. All his thoughts were incinerated, and all his awareness was banished by torment. He couldn't even scream because he had forgotten how. But despite all that, he was satisfied, he was thrilled. He was happy. I killed it right. There was no way to know. But then, as if to answer his faint plea, a familiar voice whispered, "You have slain a great beast, Daron of the Twilight Sea. You have received a memory." The whispers flowed into his soul as darkness encroached on his mind. "Your shadow grows stronger." As the dark island swayed under the assault of furious waves, two broken silhouettes could be seen in the raging water, slowly drifting apart. One, much larger one, had a harrowing wound on its neck. Its spine was entirely snapped, and it was partially beheaded. A fire of indescribable madness was slowly fatting away from the Leviathan's damaged eye, which was locked on the unmoving figure of the enemy even in death. The body of the azure serpent was slowly disappearing in the beautiful shine of the glowing waters as it fell into the depths. The other, smaller silhouette was torn and ravaged beyond recognition. The serpentine body of the onyx beast was cut and broken, with harrowing wounds gaping across its entire length. It seemed to be on the verge of dissolving into a swarm of intangible shadows. Before it did, however, a graceful figure in a fluttering white tunic dove from the high slope of the island and plunged into the raging waves. Struggling against the furious current, Nephis endured the pain of her flaw and swam toward the onyx serpent. Sonny was drowning in a sea of pain. His mind, what little of it was left, had become faint and fragile, ready to collapse at any moment. But it had not collapsed yet. Actually, there was a piece of good news, too. The fact that he was capable of feeling pain meant that he was still alive. The fact that he was still alive meant that the azure serpent was dead. Otherwise, it would have finished Sonny off already. I won. It was a small consolation. The pain was so unbearable that he almost wished for death. However, Sonny was too attached to life to throw it away. If there was the tiniest chance to survive, he was going to desperately cling to it with everything he had. Before, he would have done it simply out of spite, but now there were things he cherished and goals he wished to achieve. He really wanted to live. What the hell is happening? It was hard to form legible thoughts, but he somehow managed to evaluate his current state. Overwhelming pain, the loss of all senses. He was in shock. He was in a pain shock due to his shadow incarnation receiving severe damage. His soul had been wounded terribly. Which meant what? He didn't know. What was he supposed to do? Was there anything to do? It hurts. For now, Sonny decided to do his best to endure the pain and hold his crumbling mind together. It wasn't easy or pleasant or possible, but he persisted. He persisted with everything he had. And after an eternity of torment, there was finally a change. Sonny seemed to regain his hearing. The first thing he heard was Neff's distorted cry. "Sonny, don't die, please." He was strangely annoyed. Crap, that was an order, wasn't it? She broke her promise. Not that it could change anything. It would have been great if Nephis giving him an order to survive magically restored his body and healed his wounds. But Sonny had to be able to execute a command for Shadow Bond to compel him into action or inaction. So if Nephis suddenly decided to order him to go and bring her the moon one day, at most he would be forced to fruitlessly try his best. And he was already trying his best to survive. No, really, who does she take me for? Nephis had been the one who called him a cockroach in the first place. As a compliment, of course, he would do everything in his power to remain alive. There was no need to shout. Sunny slowly realized that his thoughts were becoming longer and more cohesive. Something is changing. Slowly his senses returned one after another. Hearing was first, followed by shadow sense of touch, smell, taste, and finally sight. It was all a proper mess, though his vision was blurry and his other senses were going haywire. There was more pain, too, this time of a physical nature. Why am I even feeling physical pain? I am a manifested shadow right now, technically. Perhaps it was a phantom pain. Even though Sunny did not possess a human body at the moment, his mind was still that of a human. And when his mind perceived the dreadful damage done to his shadow body, it reacted the only way it knew how, by panicking and drowning itself in pain. Curses! Sunny gritted his teeth and was startled by the fact that he had regained the ability to grit his teeth. Even more surprising was the fact that it was fangs and not teeth that he was grinding against each other. His shell seemed to have held together somehow. Finally, he became lucid enough to understand the situation. The tumultuous waters of the great river were suffused with a soft radiance, indicating that it was still night. More than that, he judged that less than a minute had passed since his final clash with the azure serpent, with Daron of the Twilight Sea. He knew that because the colossal corpse of the ferocious great beast could still be seen, barely, as it slowly sank into the depths of the river. The frightening silhouette of the ancient Leviathan grew smaller as it fell into the unfathomable depths and dissolved in the beautiful glow. A complicated mix of emotions rose in Sunny's heart when he saw his enemy dead. There was dark glee, a strange hint of sorrow, respect, contempt, hatred, curiosity, suspicion. There was also a strong feeling of regret. That was a supreme soul shard disappearing into the depths, after all. He groaned. Turning his attention away from the body of the slain Leviathan, Sunny tried to understand what was happening around him. He perceived his long serpentine body, now mangled and savagely ripped apart. It felt weak, understandably so, but also weaker than that. The soul flame. The soul flame was gone. He was only augmented by the 5 shadows now. Finally, Sunny noticed Nephi's. Her small figure was on top of him. She must have climbed onto his giant body while he was floating lifelessly in the water, paralyzed by pain and on the verge of losing consciousness. Both of her palms were pressed against broken onyx scales, and her skin was shining with soft white radiance. She must have retrieved her flames. Nephi's was healing him. But suddenly, her radiant figure exploded with light, dispelling the darkness of the night like an actual star. Sunny felt the familiar warmth, now much more intense than it had ever been before, flowing into him like a flood. And embraced by that warmth, his broken form started to restore itself. As he felt it startled, his deeply wounded soul was healed. His half-destroyed shadow incarnation was restored to a pristine state, and shockingly, even his serpentine shell knitted itself back together. The harrowing wounds closed, the shattered onyx scales glued themselves back together. By the time Neph's radiance wavered and fell, Sunny was as good as new. The pain that had been tormenting him receded, then disappeared completely. He was alive again. Nephi's fell powerlessly on his wide back. She remained motionless for a few moments, then dragged her body up and clutched to 2 of the horn-like spikes growing from the crown of his head, where the dorsal fin ended. Right. The azure serpent was dead, but they were still far from being safe. In fact, they were in mortal peril, much more so than when the great beast had been alive. It was because there was no one to stop the dark butterfly from conquering the carcass of the black turtle anymore. Worse than that, the abominable creature had surely noticed a blinding star suddenly igniting in the darkness of the night. It was bound to descend upon them at any moment. So it was time for the second part of the plan. We actually made it so far, huh? It was time to leave the dark island behind and run. Let's go, Neff. Dismissing Saint, Sonny spent a split second to gather the strength permeating the vast expanse of his mighty, serpentine body. Then, with Nephi's on his back, he lowered his head and dove into the endlessly flowing, radiant waters of the great river. Sonny dove into the shining depths of the great river. His serpentine body was like a spear carved from black onyx, cutting through the radiant water with stunning, terrible speed. It was made to rule the sea, so no ship or vessel could compete with him in the deep. A great monster, though. Even though the dark butterfly was an aerial abomination, it had shown a dreadful ability to fight the azure serpent underwater with strange ease. They needed to escape being noticed by it, and so Sonny swam down. Nephi's had the essence pearl, so he was not afraid of pulling her so deep that she would drown. That said, he was afraid of the depths. There was no telling what was hiding at the bottom of the great river. What kind of horrors lived there? Did time exist there, and if so, what was its flow? Sonny did not know, and he wasn't ready to find out. The plan they had concocted was to dive deep enough to avoid the notice of the dark butterfly and then travel downstream, gradually returning to the surface. He saw no reason to change it. As the onyx serpent moved down into the flowing abyss with a fragile human figure clutching to his horns, the dark island slowly disappeared in the distance. Its ominous silhouette was consumed by the radiance of the water, and soon there was nothing around them but shining emptiness. Sonny felt a strange, melancholy brush against his heart and steeled himself. They had finally escaped from the shell of the black turtle. That place, it had given him the peace and comfort he so desperately needed after the disastrous resolution of the dreadful and bitterly long Southern campaign. For a while, it was like a paradise. But that paradise was a dark one. In the end, it had turned into a death trap, and now they were leaving both the paradise and the trap behind. Don't look back. He refused to. There were, without a doubt, a lot of much more harrowing obstacles waiting for them ahead, and hopefully at the end of them all, they would be able to find a new paradise of their own. Sonny carried Nephi's deeper and deeper into the great river. Slowly, the radiance of the water grew brighter, its flow more tumultuous, and the pressure assaulting them heavier. Knowing that his serpentine shell was much more resilient than Neph's body, he hesitated to go any further. It was enough, anyway. If the dark butterfly was going to pursue them, it would have already plunged into the river and attacked. A powerful sense of relief flooded his mind. Thank the gods. Sonny barely survived a battle with a great beast, and that was mostly due to the fact that the azure serpent had already been wounded, exhausted, and close to death. Fighting a great monster immediately after that battle would have surely been the end of him. Twisting his giant body, Sonny slowed their descent, and then pushed forward. His already tremendous speed increased even more when he started to move with the current. It was to such a degree that Nephi struggled to hold on to his horns despite her ascended strength. But there was no helping it. Now that they had escaped the dark island and the monstrous butterfly, another challenge lay in front of them, one that was perhaps even harder to overcome. That challenge was the expanse of the great river itself. There was no point in leaving the dark island if all that awaited them was a slow, agonizing death. There were harrowing abominations of all kinds dwelling both in the water and in the boundless sky. Without anywhere to find shelter, doom was all but guaranteed. They might escape it once or twice, perhaps even a dozen times. But sooner or later, exhaustion would overwhelm them and their luck would run out. Then, the great river would become their grave. That was why Sonny and Nephi's had a clear goal in mind. They had to travel downstream, as far into the past as they could, and discover the ancient people who had entered the tomb of Ariel thousands of years ago. Sonny was incredibly swift while encased in the shell of the onyx serpent. He could cover a great distance in a short amount of time, traveling much further than the carcass of the black turtle had been pulled by the current in an entire month. The problem was essence. Existing as a shadow incarnation was consuming his essence, and sustaining the massive shape of the river serpent was consuming it as well. He had already spent a lot of essence fighting the mad Leviathan, and although Nef's flame was enhancing his soul to a degree, his reserves were not infinite. Even though he was a tyrant, they were not at all adequate for the task at hand. And so, Sonny had to hurry. He had to squeeze all the speed he could muster from his serpentine form while he could. If his essence ran out before they found land, or anything at all to climb onto, there would be no choice but to remain drifting in the water, slowly recovering their powers and hopping desperately that nothing would attack them in the meantime. The dwellers of the deep, the swarms of abominable krill, the flying predators that hunted creatures inhabiting the river. He didn't think that they would live long enough for their essence to be replenished. Praying that something appeared on the horizon, Sonny flew through the shining water. His powerful body cut through the flowing abyss, leaving a trail of raging turbulence in its wake. Nephi's clung desperately to his horns. Exhausted by the explosion of healing flames she had created earlier to save him, and the harrowing pain of having to use her aspect for so long, and with such intensity. Strangely enough, Sonny had ended up in a better state than her, despite being the one who had fought in the battle with the Azure Serpent. The longer they swam, the more worried about her he became. But he was tired too. His wounds might have healed, but the terrible mental exhaustion remained, smothering his ability to remain clear-headed and strive forward without rest. Slowly, a cold lethargy was seeping into his mind. Struggling against it, he continued to swim forward. Sonny did not know how far, exactly, they had traveled away from the dark island, but the distance had to be immense. His shadow shell was not only enormous, it was also created to reign in the water. Considering that he was moving with the current of the great river, his already great speed was enhanced even more. So he decided that it would be safe to rise to the surface. Gradually ascending, he tore through the radiant abyss and finally raised his head above the glistening waves. Still clinging to his horns, Nephi slumped down and breathed heavily. It had been hard for her to withstand the resistance of the water, which had been battering her like a ram for so long. The greater Sonny's speed was, the greater was the resistance. She had already been exhausted by straining her ability beyond its limit, and enduring the feverish race through the depths could not have been easy. But now that the onyx serpent's head was above water, Nephi's could finally rest a little. The sky was still impenetrably black. A soft glow was rising from the river, illuminating the vast emptiness of its flowing expanse. The view was as dreamlike and magical as it had been on the first day Sonny had seen it. But his heart was pierced by despair. It was because even now, after leaving the dark island so far behind, he couldn't see any hint of land anywhere around them. An old doubt crawled into his mind, sapping strength from his tired body. What if there is no land? What if this whole world is nothing but water? Gritting his fangs, Sonny let out a quiet growl and strained every fiber of his shell to accelerate even more. With his onyx snout as the spearhead and his black dorsal fin as a sharp blade, he cut the glowing surface of the great river. Faster, faster. He was not out of essence yet. There was a certain sense of exhilaration he felt, flying toward the horizon with terrible speed. The speed, the might of his shell, the slender weight of Nef's body pressing down on his scales, and the empty vastness of the boundless black sky, it was almost liberating. But at the same, his heart was drowning in anxiety, fear, and dread. And soon he was proven right to be afraid. Sonny felt an ominous premonition and rose his head a little higher above the water. In the next moment, his serpentine eyes narrowed. There ahead of them, the surface of the great river was seething and boiling. A boundless krill swarm was swiftly moving to meet them, hundreds of thousands of corrupted beasts burning with a mad desire to devour the onyx serpent and his rider alive. Sunny's enormous body shuddered, but he tried to remain calm. This is not the end. The krill swarm was a harrowing foe, but the terror of it lay in how numerous the river locusts were. The hungry legion rushing towards Sunny was the largest he had ever seen by far, enough so that even the azure serpent might have been unable to prevail against it. However, unlike the ancient Leviathan, Sunny was not constrained by the need to defend his prey, and while the krill were numerous, they were not individually strong. Much more importantly, they were not too fast. Cutting a sharp turn, Sunny roared and flew west, parallel to the approaching mass of abominations. His feverish thoughts dissolved into a simple, bestial need to outrun the swarm. The distance between them grew smaller with frightening speed, and yet he still couldn't see the edge of the vast patch of rough water. And by the time he saw it, there was no time left. Damn it! As Nephi's picked herself up and summoned a sword, Sunny plunged into the mass of krill. The water surged around him, creating a barrier, but more than a few abominations passed through it. His jaws snapped and Neph's sword flashed. A few moments later, they broke the wall of river locusts and tore free of the swarm. Sunny had just barely reached the edges of the rough water patch, and even though they had to go through the krill at the very end, the expanse of the great river in front of them was clear. Sunny swam with all his might, skirting the pursuing swarm and increasing the distance between the slithering locusts and his tail. Faster, faster, faster. Soon the krill were left far behind. Nephi slumped again, clutching her sword with a trembling hand. He did not have a lot of essence left. They continued to move downstream, covering a tremendous distance. The onyx serpent flew like an arrow, much faster than any arrow could fly, but that was still not enough. After the first swarm, there was another. After the second swarm, there was a harrowing creature that lunged at them from the depths. After the creature, there was a gargantuan mass of rotting seaweed that almost ensnared and devoured them, a dozen grotesque maws suddenly appearing from beneath the swaying weeds. And after that, there were more horrors than he could count. Flocks of predatory birds that seemed to have pearls growing in their desiccated flesh, invisible creatures that were able to instantly turn large spans of the river into adamantine ice, ghostly lights that burned in the depths of the water, filling their minds with an indescribable desire to approach them. But Sunny was a river serpent, a monarch among beasts. His long body was fast, mighty, and tenacious. He was incredibly fast and at home in the water. He had outrun the krill, tore through the rotting seaweed, dove into the depths to avoid the birds of prey, broke through the ice, resisted the allure of the ghostly lights. He had escaped from them all. However, his essence was running dry. It was almost gone. He was exhausted and well past the limits of his mental strength. And there was still no land in sight. By the time the seven suns slowly appeared from beyond the horizon, chasing away the impenetrable darkness, and the great river stopped shining, he was utterly spent. It was not even a matter of willpower anymore. It was simply a matter of not having anything else to give. His essence was fully depleted. Finally, despair consumed his heart. The shadow shell was the first to crumble. The mighty onyx serpent shuddered, and then dissolved into shadows, which were instantly chased away by the pale light of dawn. His incarnation disappeared next. Sunny turned intangible, and was then thrown out of the embrace of the shadows, finally regaining his human form. He was in pain. Every muscle in his body felt like it was about to burst. His lungs felt as if they were consumed by fire. His head was heavy and his limbs were weak. He even failed to adapt to the change in time, swallowing a mouthful of water. Which was fine, he was dying from thirst anyway. Sunny felt himself sinking and struggled weakly to stay afloat, but even that was too much of a strain. Am I going to drown? A moment later, a strong arm embraced him, and he felt Nephi's pressing his body against hers. Swimming with the help of her one free hand, she pulled them both upward. Soon, their heads broke the surface of the water. Sonny was momentarily blinded by sunlight and coughed, trying to push air into his lungs. Over, it's over. We won't survive the few days needed for our essence to recover. As he tried to think of something, anything, that could keep them alive, a strange shiver suddenly ran through Neff's body. Since she was still hugging him from behind, he could feel it clearly. "Sonny, Sonny." He tried to answer, and was suddenly struck by the strangeness of his human body. It felt alien and tiny, not at all befitting a ferocious serpent like him. He had forgotten how to talk. Snap out of it, damn it. Sonny slowly gathered his senses, remembering what it meant to be human. Then he moved his unfamiliar tongue and said hoarsely, "What?" Neph's eyes moved, turning them both to face downstream. Her voice was just as hoarse as his. "There." He frowned, following the direction where her finger was pointing with his gaze, and then froze. There on the water, no more than 100 meters away. A small boat was swaying on the waves, both of its sails lowered. It was made out of beautiful dark wood, with intricate patterns carved along its sides. There was no movement inside, but the boat seemed to be staying in place, strangely unaffected by the strong current of the great river. And so they were being slowly pulled in its direction. A small wooden vessel was resting on the sparkling water. The 7 suns were rising from the distant depths, and the world was painted in the lilac hues of early dawn. Illuminated by that beautiful light, the vessel seemed like an illusion. "What is this?" His hoarse voice was full of disbelief. It was just too improbable to find an empty boat swaying gently on the waves just when his essence had run out, and despair had taken hold of his heart. The great river was inconceivably vast, and yet they had just happened to find themselves a mere 100 meters away from a boat at that exact moment. Even when fated was involved, the coincidence seemed too convenient. It was to such a degree that Sonny even considered that he was hallucinating. Wouldn't be the first time anyway. Maybe the sin of solace had learned a new trick. However, Nephi saw the boat too. She hesitated for a moment, then said numbly, "It's a ketch." Sonny was about to ask what the word ketch meant, but he was too tired for unnecessary questions. It was probably a type of boat, regardless. Nephi's knew about these things, considering that she had even built one for them, back on the forgotten shore. It was probably also a part of her legacy training. The two of them remained still for a few seconds, then swam toward the ketch. Well, Nephi's was the only one swimming while supporting Sonny. He just weakly moved his legs to help her a little. Soon they reached it. Sonny placed his palm on the hull of the sailboat, still unsure if it was real. However, the dark wood felt smooth and solid to his touch. He traced his hand across it, both stunned and relieved. It might be a trap. Even if it was, they had no choice but to climb into the ketch. It was too small to protect them from great abominations like the azure serpent, but anything was better than nothing. More than that, the ketch couldn't be as simple as it looked. It was drifting in the harrowing waters of the great river without a scratch on its hull after all. A mundane boat would have been destroyed in a matter of hours here. Even the piece of flotsam that Sonny had once used as a raft, which was tough enough to withstand the nails of a master, was turned into tiny splinters. It had to have been a part of a large vessel before turning into flotsam, too, and that mysterious vessel had ended up being destroyed. Plus, the ketch was not really drifting. It was staying in place, unaffected by the current of time, so it was certainly special in some way. A tentative spark of hope ignited in Sonny's heart. Despite the modest size of the wooden sailboat, its sides were too tall for them to simply climb over them, especially in their weakened state. However, a rope ladder was conveniently lowered into the water near the bow of the ketch, as if inviting them in. Sonny and Nephi's glanced at each other. His paranoia was acting up not without a reason, and from the looks of it, she felt the same way. But there was no decision to make. Since salvation miraculously presented itself, they would be fools not to accept the unexpected gift. Nephi's pushed Sonny toward the ladder, and then helped him climb up. Falling over the side of the ketch, Sonny sprawled on the wooden floor. The feeling of something solid under him was both unfamiliar and heavenly. The gentle swaying of the boat was like a lullaby. A moment later, Nephi's awkwardly climbed over the rim and tumbled down, landing squarely on top of him. Sonny let out a weak groan. Now, they remained motionless for a few moments, catching their breaths, then slowly extricated themselves from each other and took a cautious look around. The ketch was not too big, about 7 meters long. Its layout was very simple. There was only a single deck, with no roofed interior or cabins. The deck was completely open, with 2 masts, a longer one and a shorter one, rising into the air like slender, dark pillars. Everything was made with a mundane but exquisite level of craftsmanship. The wooden surfaces were tastefully engraved, showing all sorts of flowing images, now smoothed out by the wind, water, and passage of time. The ketch seemed like the loving creation of a supremely skilled artisan, even if it had seen better days. One look was enough to tell that the wooden boat was very old. However, it had been maintained with the utmost care, remaining in near-perfect condition. Sonny was musing about who could have taken care of the ketch when his gaze finally reached the stern, where the steering oar was supposed to be. Unlike the chain breaker, there was no runic circle for the helmsman. Instead, there was only a very mundane wooden bench. And there on that bench, a corpse was sitting with its head hung low. His body suddenly grew stiff. What? Sonny was momentarily paralyzed by shock. Because that corpse, it looked eerily familiar. It was shrouded in a dark mantle, which made it hard to determine whether the body belonged to a man or a woman. All that he could see was that the person was of small stature and terribly thin. Their long white hair moved slightly in the wind, and their face. The face was obscured by a mask of black lacquered wood. The mask was carved to resemble the face of a ferocious demon. Its teeth were bared, with 4 fangs protruding from its mouth, and there were 3 twisted horns rising from it like a crown. Inside the black chasms of its eyes, there was nothing but pure darkness. It was Weaver's mask. And the corpse was just like the one he had found beneath the ruined cathedral of the Dark City, all those years ago. Sonny found himself unable to move for a few moments. Encountering the ketch just when they desperately needed shelter was already shocking enough. Finding a corpse that looked eerily similar to the nameless prisoner of the hidden dungeon beneath the ruined cathedral inside the ketch, it sent him into a fugue state. All kinds of wild thoughts rushed through his mind. For a split second, Sonny even imagined that it was his own corpse, brought here from the future by some strange anomaly of the mystical river. But no, the proportions were all wrong. He was not a tall man, but the mysterious person was even smaller. They were practically tiny. In fact, now that Sonny had taken a good look at the corpse, he realized that it was different from the prisoner of the ruined cathedral as well. The dark mantle and the mask were the same, but the body hidden beneath them was not. Even with its features obfuscated, he could tell the difference. Still, what was the meaning of this? How could there be another Weaver's mask? Who were these 2 people, and how could they be so similar despite the great divide between the Dark City and the tomb of Ariel? Nephi seemed startled as well, albeit for a different reason than Sonny. She did notice his strong reaction, though. "Sonny, what is it?" She must have noticed that the mask the corpse was wearing was the same mask Mongrel wore. She also knew that it was a divine memory of the 7th tier, even if Sunny had never told her where Weaver's mask came from. He took a deep breath. That corpse, it's just like the one I found in the dark city beneath the cathedral. That was where I got the mask. Sunny had found the spawn of the vile thieving bird by pure coincidence, even if that coincidence might not have happened without the influence of fated. Everything that followed after absorbing the drop of ichor that contained blood weave, however, was the result of logic and reason. It was the consequence of that first chance encounter. Guided by the ability to see the radiance of divinity which blood weave granted him, he explored the cathedral of the dark city and received Weaver's mask. Guided by Weaver's mask, he dove into the sky below, reached the ebony tower, and discovered Weaver's severed arm, thus acquiring bone weave. What was the cause of this situation then? Was it a coincidence or the result of his choices? As Sunny was spacing out, consumed by these thoughts, Nephi's looked at him with a frown. "Corpse, what do you mean?" He shivered. Could she not see the hunched figure sitting on the helmsman's bench? He took a step forward and pointed with a hurried motion. That, don't you see that corpse?" Nephi seemed both wary and slightly confused. "Of course I see that person. It's just that, why do you keep calling them a corpse? That person is alive." Sunny's eyes widened, and in the next moment the corpse moved. With a deep sigh, its hanging head rose, and two dark chasms carved into the fearsome mask stared at Sunny with an ineffable emotion. Then the corpse slowly, arduously stood up. No, not the corpse, the person. The wearer of Weaver's mask was indeed alive. Sunny watched silently, unable to move, only his hand stretched out a little, ready to summon a weapon. Once the owner of the ketch rose to their feet, he realized that they were indeed very small. The figure shrouded by the dark mantle was extremely thin, seeming weak and frail. The person's back was hunched, and their hands seemed to be shaking slightly. It was no surprise that Sunny had mistaken the wearer of the mask for a corpse. With the person remaining utterly motionless and his perception painted by the encounter in the dungeon of the ruined cathedral, it would have been strange for him to assume that they were alive. The hunched stranger froze, looking at them through the lightless pits of the black lacquered mask's eyes. Sunny and Nephi's weren't moving either, not knowing what to do. They had just unceremoniously climbed into this person's boat, so what was there to do? Ask politely to be saved, or attack them out of fear? Sunny secretly shifted his gaze, trying to determine whether the wearer of the mask was a human or a nightmare creature. However, just like with the corpse beneath the cathedral, the dark mantle and the mask were impenetrable. Beyond them lay an unknowable abyss. An icy chill crept up his spine. Then the owner of the ketch slowly raised their hands, which were wrapped in black gloves. The thin fingers touched the edges of the black lacquered mask and slowly pulled it down. The face that was revealed belonged to a human. She was an old, extremely old woman. Sunny had never seen anyone who looked so ancient. He couldn't quite believe that someone that aged could still be alive. Her tanned skin was covered in a spiderweb of deep, cavernous wrinkles and clung to her emaciated face like fragile paper. Her long hair was entirely white and thin, revealing glimpses of the brown parchment of her scalp. Her eyes, which had been piercing once, were now dull and obscured by milky cataracts. The old woman's small, hunched body was frail and thin, as if ready to collapse from the smallest gale. The dark mantle hung listlessly from it, a few sizes too big. Nevertheless, she was emanating a feeling of unimpeachable dignity, willpower, and sanctity, even. The black mask fell to the deck of the ketch with a wooden clack. The old woman was looking at Sunny and Nephi silently, one moment passing after another. And then she moved. Bending down, she groaned and slowly kneeled. Sunny was startled, but most of all, he felt a strong urge to jump forward and stop her. It felt incredibly wrong to see such an old woman prostrating herself. let alone in front of him. He noticed Neff's back growing stiff as she felt the same. The corner of her eye twitched, but neither of them moved. Finally, the old woman's knees touched the deck. Placing both hands in front of her, she took a shaky breath and then kowtowed deeply. Her quiet voice sounded like a scraping quill. Hearing it, Sonny flinched. She said, "Hail, Weaver, demon of fate." In the silence that followed, he hesitated for a while and then answered, "Firstborn of the unknown." The old woman remained motionless for a few moments, and then let out a long sigh. Lowering her head even closer to the deck, she spoke with reverence. "Ankh greets the children of Weaver. Ankh greets the children of Weaver." The word hung in the air. Sonny and Nephi's glanced at each other warily, both confused by this strange situation. Why was the old woman prostrating in front of them? Why had she addressed them as children of Weaver? What is going on? Sonny was tired out of his mind, and the inexplicable nature of the strange old woman was simply too much for him to process. She didn't seem hostile, at least. With a sigh, he allowed his exhausted body to collapse and sat down on the wooden deck of the ketch. Nephi's, meanwhile, hesitated for a few moments, then took several steps forward and carefully pulled the old woman up. "Please rise, grandmother. Do not bow on our account." The owner of the ketch, Ankh, allowed herself to be gently pulled into a sitting position. Then, Nephi's returned to Sonny and sat side by side with him. The two of them were now facing the old woman, waiting for her to say something. But she remained silent. After a few moments passed, Sonny frowned. He felt nervous. There was no telling just how powerful this woman was and what her intentions were. Ankh was a complete mystery. She could also provide answers to many mysteries that had plagued him. So he asked, "I am sorry, grandmother, but why did you call us the children of Weaver?" There were many questions he wanted to ask, but this one was the most pressing. Its answer could explain how old Ankh would treat them. The old woman took a deep sigh, then spoke in her thin, creaky voice. "Because you are the chosen of the nightmare spell. You are a miracle. Your existence is Weaver's triumph." A proud smile appeared on her lips. It was warm and almost motherly, as though she was indeed a grandmother looking at her young, beautiful grandchildren. Sonny took a deep breath, feeling embarrassed. Weaver's triumph. He was all but certain that the nightmare spell had been created by the demon of fate. Now, the last, tiny sliver of doubt had disappeared. Weaver was indeed the being responsible for the great calamity that had befallen Earth, or maybe for its salvation. Regardless, old Ankh seemed to have a deep connection to Weaver and the nightmare spell. She was also, most likely, one of the people they had wanted to find, a native inhabitant of the great river, one of the ancient people who had entered the tomb of Ariel before the gods fell. But wouldn't it mean that she had come to the great river before the spell was created? Things were still not making any sense. As if reading his thoughts, Nephi's leaned forward and asked as politely as she could, "Forgive me for asking, but who are you, grandmother?" Ankh smiled. What she said next made both Sonny and Nephi's flinch. "I am Ankh, the priestess of the nightmare spell." In the silence that followed, the old woman gently shook her head. "It must be hard for you to imagine, my lord and lady. You come from a time when the nightmare spell has matured and rules unopposed, its blessings given freely to all. But it wasn't always like that. At the beginning, which was also the end, when the nightmare spell was still in its infancy, there was a need for people like me to tend to it, protect it, and above all to help it spread so that it could grow stronger." Her wrinkled face grew somber, and a heavy sigh escaped from her lips. Which wasn't easy at all. After all, we, the followers of a demon, were deemed heretics and persecuted by servants of the gods. All were despised, many were hunted down and put to death. Well, not that I experienced any of that myself. Every sentence the old woman spoke was a revelation, and they followed one after another. There were so many startling pieces of information she was sharing freely with them that Sonny found himself unable to digest it all. He felt like a person who was drowning in a deep sea after spending years dying from thirst in the desert. Priestess of the Nightmare spell, the beginning that was also the end, must be the early stages of the war between the demons and the gods. Wait, the spell was not created as it is today. It had to grow, be grown even, persecuted by the gods. What? He was failing desperately to keep up, tired as he was. Nephise was struggling too, but it seemed as though she had a slightly better grasp of the conversation. White sparks ignited in her eyes. So, our existence is proof that the suffering of the followers of Weaver was not meaningless, that the nightmare spell you worshipped and proselytized has realized its great design. Anank nodded and looked at them with reverence, which made both feel uncomfortable. Indeed, you are very wise, my lady. Nephise remained silent for a few moments, then remarked evenly, "You don't seem to be surprised by the fact that we come from the future." Sonny forced himself to focus. It was a very poignant question, and one that he had failed to think of himself, distracted by the avalanche of revelations. The old woman slowly nodded, her breath ragged. It seemed that it was hard for her to speak for so long, but she still forced herself to answer. "Of course I am not surprised. Haven't you come from upstream, my lord and lady?" Nephise and Sonny glanced at each other. They had indeed. The natives of the great river which flowed from the future into the past would have had a different perception of time. For them, people from the future might not seem that strange. Anning took a breath, then added tiredly, "Oh, but I was also warned that you would come." Huh. That was perhaps the most shocking revelation yet. After a moment of silence, Sonny raised an eyebrow while hiding how shaken he truly was. "Warned how?" The old woman nodded again, her unbound white hair moving in the wind. "I received a message in my dreams, a message that the children of Weaver would come, and that—" She paused for a few moments, catching her breath, then finished fervently, "and that I must help them reach fallen grace, where Dusk, the last of the Sibyls, reigns. Dusk, Sibyl of the fallen grace." Sonny shivered. Of course, he remembered who Dusk was. He was wearing a tunic called Shroud of Graceless Dusk. After all, the transcendent memory of the 6th tier he had received for slaying the terror of Low 49. That damned horror. If he were to try and assign numbers to the enemies he had faced in Antarctica based on how many mental scars they left him with, the beautiful flower of floating white silk would be squarely placed second, right behind the winter beast. Even Goliath, who had literally killed him, did not leave as harrowing of an impression. Of course, Dusk was most likely neither dead nor corrupted yet in the nightmare. She was still a human, and seemed to be ruling a place called Fallen Grace. Since Sonny and Nephise wanted to reach the civilization of the Great River and find the Sibyls, this destination was perfect. It was a little bit too perfect, even. Anank had answered one of the most important questions they had. The improbable coincidence of them finding her catch just when they needed it was no coincidence at all. She had come knowingly, expecting to find them. But who was it that had instructed her where to find them? In her dreams, no less. Who was pulling the strings of this nightmare behind the scenes? Is it perhaps the last Sibyl herself? Sonny frowned, knowing that he would not find the answer any time soon. The earliest opportunity was probably going to be when he came face to face with the Sibyl of the Fallen Grace again. He sighed. "Fallen Grace, how far is that?" Old Anank hesitated for a few moments. "It is far, very, very far, so far that I won't be able to guide you all the way there." She grew silent, her eyes closing slightly. It almost seemed as though she had dozed off. Then, however, the old woman shook slightly and added, But I will take you as far as I can go, my lord and lady. Ah, you see, we demon followers weren't welcome here in Ariel's tomb either. They chased us away, and we traveled upstream for a long time before settling down and building Weave. Weave. It's one of the human cities on the great river like Fallen Grace. Or at least, it used to be. Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other. Why was it that Anak was unable to return downstream? Was there some kind of internal strife between the locals of the great river? Would it be dangerous for her to enter the waters controlled by the Sibyls? And what did she mean, that Weave only used to be a city? Nephi spoke cautiously. We wouldn't want to put you in danger, grandmother. The old woman smiled. Helping you is both my wish and privilege, my lady. Do not worry about me. I am of the great river. Her speech was slowing down, and her words became slurred. It was obvious that the old woman was growing too tired to continue the conversation. She seemed to have understood that, too. With a soft sigh, Anak raised her hands. In the next moment, Sunny and Nephi's both stared in bewilderment as a whirlwind of white sparks appeared in the air. She is summoning a memory. This action, which was so mundane and familiar to them, looked infinitely strange and out of place when performed by one of the ancient humans. It was the ability of those infected by the spell, after all, and no one they had met in all the nightmares possessed it. Soon, a wooden box appeared on the deck in front of them. Anak opened it with shaking hands and took out several items. A beautifully embroidered tablecloth, a carafe of wine, a painted ceramic teapot with steam rising from its spout, 2 small cups and 2 plates, one full of ripe fruits, the other full of small savory pies. The fruits were succulent and the pies looked freshly cooked. The items were simple and modest, even worn out a little, yet lovingly maintained. A delicious smell spread through the air. Anak carefully placed everything on the tablecloth and offered the food to Sunny and Nephi's. My lord, my lady, you must be tired after braving the horrors of the future. Please eat and rest. I will guide us back to Weave first. She took a deep breath, then slowly rose to her feet and walked back to the helmsman's bench with effort. Sitting down on it, the old woman tiredly lowered her head and whispered several strange, unintelligible words. In the next moment, the ketch suddenly moved. The midnight-colored sails rose by themselves and billowed in the wind, while the steering oar swayed, turning the bow of the boat downstream. Soon, they were sailing across the sparkling expanse of the great river, slowly gaining speed. Sunny and Nephi's hesitated for a bit. Both of them were completely exhausted and incredibly hungry, but they still did not trust the old woman. What if the food was poisoned? What if she was waiting until they fell asleep to kill them? Sunny glanced at the frail figure of the priestess. She looked too fragile and weak to pose any threat to them. Of course, looks could be deceiving, but he also felt that Anak had been sincere and treated them with nothing except great benevolence. It was hard to dislike or distrust the kind, earnest old woman. Ah, whatever. Even if she had done something to the food, he was very hard to poison. Blood Weave made him all but immune to most toxins, after all. Shaking off the mad desire to devour everything in sight, the faint remnant of the ferocious form of the river serpent, he tentatively picked up a savory pie, still warm from the oven, and took a bite. His hand trembled. Delicious, so delicious. Not wasting any more time, Sunny sent the whole pie into his mouth and chewed greedily. A few moments later, he raised his thumb and nudged Nephi's with his elbow. She lingered for a moment, then followed his example. They ate and drank like 2 kids being spoiled by their grandmother, oblivious to everything else. Soon, the entire meal disappeared. They didn't even spare the wine. After that, Sunny felt incredibly sleepy. But it wasn't the unnatural feeling of having been drugged. It was simply the natural reaction of his abused body demanding some well-deserved and much-needed rest. Safe, we're safe, I think. Struggling to keep his eyes open, Sonny looked at Nephi's. She was tired too, and yet she nodded to answer his silent question. It's all right, I'll take the first watch you can. Before she even finished the sentence, Sonny had already dropped his head on her lap, fast asleep. Sonny slept like a baby. There were no nightmares haunting his dreams, and when he woke up, his heart felt strangely at peace. He remained motionless for a while, feeling the warmth of Neff's hand resting on the crown of his head. The ketch was moving swiftly across the water, carried by both the wind and the current, and the world around them was dark. It was already night. I overslept. Nephi should have woken him up. Had she gotten any rest herself? Turning his head slightly, Sonny looked up and saw her elegant jawline. She was leaning on the wooden side of the ketch, her eyes closed. Her breathing was slow and deep. She was fast asleep. So no one was keeping watch. Don't be upset with the lady, my lord. Sonny flinched slightly and glanced at the stern of the boat, where Anik was still sitting, holding lightly to the steering oar. Her dark mantle was of the same color as the night sky, making it hard to discern where its folds ended, and the night began. You both needed rest. Sonny felt very comfortable laying on Neff's lap, but he had to sit up with a reluctant sigh. Rubbing his eyes, he looked at his shadows, which were all but invisible in the darkness. None of them showed any sign of being concerned, so he judged that the old woman had not tried anything strange while they slept. Even though it would take a few more days for his reserves of essence to be fully replenished, they were not dry anymore. Due to the shroud of dusk, he also felt rested and refreshed. However, he was slightly hungry. Sonny hesitated for a few moments and then asked, "Say, you wouldn't happen to have more of those little pies?" Anik smiled. "There should be a few left in the box. Eat well, my lord. I made them with care." Sonny noted that the wooden box was not a memory that created food, but instead a storage memory that helped keep supplies fresh. Everything inside must have been prepared by Anik in anticipation of meeting the children of Weaver. Opening the lid, he discovered a few leftover pies, as well as more fruit and a couple other simple dishes, all perfectly fresh and preserved. It smelled so wonderful that he remained motionless for a moment, enjoying the fragrance. Misunderstanding his hesitation, the old woman spoke. "I'm sorry that I can't offer you more, my lord. It is not easy for me to procure fruit and flour these days. I hope you are not too disappointed." Sonny looked at her and smiled. "What are you talking about, grandmother? I once ate nothing but rotten devil meat for an entire month. This is nothing short of a feast." To illustrate his point, he picked up one of the pies and greedily pushed it into his mouth. Anik tilted her head a little. Do people still suffer from hunger in the future? Sonny chewed for a long time before answering. The old woman clearly believed that the future was some kind of a paradise that she and the other followers of Weaver helped create. He didn't want to hurt her feelings. He shrugged. "Smart people don't. But I am not too smart myself, sadly, at least not all the time." Then a sudden thought flashed through his mind. Sonny looked at Anik carefully, then asked, "But what about you, grandmother? Have you eaten anything?" She was so thin and frail that he had mistaken her for a corpse not too long ago. However, she had only offered the food to them, not partaking in it herself. Anik gently shook her head. "This body of mine does not get hungry often. I'll just catch some fish later." Sonny frowned, then took out the rest of the pies and walked over to the steering oar, offering them to her. "No, that won't do. Please eat some too. Otherwise, my teacher will give me a beating once I come back home." Teacher Julius would indeed be beside himself if he learned that Sonny stuffed his belly, while an elderly woman starved herself nearby, even if that woman was just a nightmare inhabitant. More than that, just what kind of fish was she going to catch in the great river? Anik hesitated a little. then took one of the pies with a shaking hand and smiled. "Thank you, my lord, that is enough." When he went back to the box, Neff stirred slightly and opened her eyes. She stared at her empty lap for a few moments, then looked at Sunny and blinked a couple of times. Finally, she sniffed the air and turned to the wooden box, guided by the enticing fragrance of the freshly cooked food. Her eyes glistened. The two of them had a scrumptious meal while Anink slowly ate her single pie. The atmosphere inside the ketch was strangely peaceful. It was as though they were sailing on a calm lake instead of the deadly expanse of the great river, where all kinds of terrifying creatures dwelled. The water was glowing with soft opalescence, while the sky was impenetrably black. The beautiful vista of the world hidden within the tomb of Ariel was as dreamlike and mystical as ever. As Sunny looked at the surface of the water, he suddenly saw its light grow dim. There was a vast, inconceivable shadow moving somewhere unfathomably deep, below them, blocking off the radiance of the drowned suns with its endless expanse. For a few moments, a bleak darkness enveloped the entire span of the great river around the ketch, and then indifferently moved on. He shivered and looked at Anink, terror hiding in his lightless eyes. The old woman calmly held the steering oar as she smiled. "Don't worry, my lord, they can't sense us." Sunny hesitated for a while, wondering if he should ask who the they she spoke of were. In the end, he remained silent. There were things that a person was better off not knowing. Sunny was not sure if he could allow himself the luxury of ignorance, but he decided to enjoy being ignorant still, at least for today. There were still a lot of questions Sunny wanted to ask Anink, and a lot he needed to learn. But surrounded by the silent darkness of the night, he simply listened to the gentle sound of water splashing against the hull of the swift ketch, and stared at the glowing expanse of the great river without saying a word. A lot had happened yesterday, gods. Was it really just a day ago that he had fought the Azure Serpent? The fearsome battle, the frantic escape from the Dark Island. There had not been a single moment of peace for him to settle himself and contemplate these matters yet. It feels like a dream. He had really done it. He had killed a great beast. Of course, it was partly due to the blessing of Neff's soul flame, as well as the fact that the Azure Serpent had been severely weakened. And yet, was there another master in the world who could boast the same feat? Surely not. Had there ever been? Sunny shifted uncomfortably, afraid that the incredible achievement would go to his head. He almost wished to hear the biting remarks of the Sin of Solace, who never missed a chance to bring him down. The bastard was somewhere nearby, but kept out of sight. He could feel the faint presence of the hateful wraith at the edges of his consciousness. Nevertheless, it was a fact Sunny had indeed slain the Azure Serpent, Daron of the Twilight Sea. What an unusual name for a nightmare creature. After observing the mad beast for so long and even assuming its form, Sunny was certain that there was something special about the ferocious abomination. Now, after learning its name, he came to strongly suspect that the Azure Serpent was not an abomination at all. Or at least had not always been one. Was the old snake actually a human once? Humans were all considered to be beasts by the spell, after all. A sovereign, for example, could be called a supreme beast. So what would happen if a sovereign succumbed to corruption? Looking at the radiant expanse of the great river, Sunny felt restless. There might be a simple way to find out. Closing his eyes, he dove into his soul sea. It was exactly the same as it had been before, with 5 black suns looming above the still water. Only now, after learning the truth of how the world of the great river had been created, he perceived it in a somewhat new light. A legion of shadows stood motionless in the silent darkness. Sunny still remembered the time when he could count the lifeless shadows with one hand, but there were so many of them now. Thousands. Have I really killed that many? Of course he had. From the forgotten shore to the tomb of Ariel, Sunny had lived a life of slaughter, even if it had not been of his own volition. The numbers had especially swelled during the Southern Campaign, where he had been constantly surrounded by vast hordes of rampant nightmare creatures. Most of the shadows were abominations. The Mountain King, the formless shadow of the unborn spawn of the vile thieving bird, the forsaken knight, the mordant mimic, the terror of Low 49, the mountainous titan Goliath. But there were plenty of humans, too. The nameless old slaver, Harper, Harris, Castor, Pierce, the Red Priest, the War Maidens, the soldiers of the Ivory City, Knight Amaran and the many awakened of the great clans he had killed in East Antarctica, Saint Dire Fang and many more. There was also Solvin, two of her actually, one that he had slain on the Chained Island and the other he had slain in the Kingdom of Hope. Sonny felt bizarre every time he saw them. But he was looking for someone else right now. He first guessed that his suspicion was right after noticing that there was no gargantuan shape of a great serpent among the shadows. And then he finally saw him, Daron of the Twilight Sea. The azure serpent had, indeed, been a human once. There in the darkness stood the shadow of a handsome man with strong facial features and fierce, downturned eyebrows. He was tall and imposing, with broad shoulders and a strong-willed, angular face. His hair was arranged in a long braid, and he wore an archaic robe that seemed both simple and regal. The azure serpent, he really was a human. Sonny froze, looking at the silent shadow. His heart was in turmoil. This was the first time he had seen a human who had succumbed to corruption, and not any human at that, a proud and mighty sovereign, an exalted being of the supreme rank. Even Solving, who had spent thousands of years being tormented by the Wormvine, never gave up her humanity. Who was King Daron? Why had he come to the tomb of Ariel? How had he ended up losing himself in the madness and turning into an abomination, becoming no different from a mindless beast? Would Sonny end up the same one day? A deep frown appeared on his face. Corruption. Sonny had not really faced corruption yet, only the result of corruption, those frenzied fiends humans of the waking world called nightmare creatures. However, he felt that if his power continued to grow, he would come into contact with it eventually, perhaps even inevitably. Troubling. He glanced at the shadow of Daron one last time, hesitated, and then said quietly, "Find peace within me, old snake. Your nightmare is over." The azure serpent had been a terrible enemy, but he had also protected Sonny and Nephi's from the other horrors of the great river. They wouldn't have been able to enjoy the blissful month on the dark island if not for his madness, hunger, and ferociousness. Sonny had learned a lot from the great serpent as well. With a sigh, he turned away and walked to stand between the 5 black suns. There was still something he needed to see. Sonny had received a memory after killing the corrupted sovereign, after all. His first memory of the supreme rank. Well, his first memory of the supreme rank that he had actually earned, as opposed to mysteriously receiving it out of nowhere. Summoning the runes, Sonny found the unfamiliar string of them and read. Memory Crown of Twilight. Memory Rank Supreme. Memory Tier I. Memory Type Tool A tool. Sonny wouldn't have minded receiving a weapon or an armor, but a tool could be incredibly valuable too. After all, he already had the Sin of Solace. The Jade Sword was only of the transcendent rank, but it still possessed the ability to cut the flesh of great nightmare creatures, albeit with some effort. It was just that Sonny had to create an opportunity to use that ability first. He also had the Mantle and the Shroud of Dusk, and while neither of them was durable enough to resist an attack by a creature like the Azure Serpent, that problem could be solved by not getting hit. Both the lack of a suitable weapon and the absence of suitable armor could be solved. A powerful tool, meanwhile, would give Sonny more ways to find the solution. So, he was not disappointed. Feeling both the gentle swaying of the ketch and the silent stillness of his soul sea, Sonny continued to study the runes. He hoped that the description of the crown of twilight would answer some of his questions. It read, Memory description. There was a king who ruled over a dying land. The king was valiant and wise. Refusing to embrace despair, he thought of an audacious plan, gathered his companions, and braved the endless desert to enter the tomb of Ariel, where the great river flowed endlessly from the future into the past. Thus, the valiant king became a guide who guarded his people in their nightmares. They built a city at the edge of dawn and gathered an army to vanquish that which was defiled. However, in the end, the army was destroyed, the city was lost, and the valiant king himself succumbed to madness. Consumed by wrath and resentment, he turned into a mindless beast and roamed the great river for countless years. Nothing could withstand his hunger and fury until, one day, the mad king met a treacherous shadow. "But what do you even know?" said the shadow. "Do you think you're so special? I know fury too. I know hunger too. I know madness too. Oh, and I've killed plenty of creatures more powerful than me too. Who are you to dare stare me down, beast? I am lost from light who was born from the shadows. I am the rightful heir of death and the bastard son of fate. Wherever I go, ruin follows. If you had any sense, you would have run away as soon as you saw me." And true to his word, treacherous Lost from Light battled the mad king, eventually becoming his doom. That was how the king, who had outlived his land, died. Sunny blinked a couple of times. What? It seemed that the spell had really liked his recent outburst. It even included it, word for word, in the description of the crown of twilight. Oh no! He looked down and covered his face with a hand. Ah, so embarrassing. Had Nephis read this already? Struggling against the desire to fall through the deck of the ketch and drown, Sunny took a deep breath and concentrated on the description. There was still a lot of information contained in the glimmering runes that he needed to ponder. So Daron came from outside the pyramid. He even fought his way through the nightmare desert, as opposed to entering a seed. There was no doubt about it, since those who had conquered a nightmare of a particular rank could not enter any seed of the same rank again. So a sovereign wouldn't be able to challenge a third nightmare. Well, actually, there was some doubt. Nothing about the tomb of Ariel and this particular nightmare was normal. Still, Sunny believed that he was right. Daron must have reached the Black Pyramid and entered the true Great River, as opposed to a version of it recreated by the spell. That next part, however, did not make any sense. He had become a guide who guarded his people in their nightmares. What did it mean? Sunny remained motionless for a while, then frowned. The most obvious answer was also the most confusing. The spell created nightmares based on the past. The Great River, however, existed simultaneously in the past, in the present, and in the future. So, if Daron had truly entered the real tomb of Ariel, then he would be present in any recreation of the Great River conjured by the spell. Therefore, if his subjects challenged a seed connected to the Black Pyramid, their sovereign would be waiting for them on the other side, to help them conquer it. If I am right, then it was indeed an audacious plan. There was just one glaring problem with this theory. It was that the seeds of nightmares, and the nightmares themselves, had not existed in the ancient past of the dream realm. No explorer had ever discovered signs that its human inhabitants had possessed knowledge of the nightmares, and Noctis had not known anything about them either. So how could Daron come up with a plan to use the uniqueness of the Great River to help his people transcend through a nightmare, if there were no nightmares at that time yet? Then again, Ankh was from a time when the seed of the spell had already existed. Granted, that time was at the start of the war between the demons and the gods, so Daron could not have lived much later. That war was the cataclysm that no one had escaped. Arg, so confusing. In any case, Daron's plan had failed. Although many of his people managed to join him within the tomb of Ariel, they died trying to destroy that which was defiled, whatever it was. Actually, That phrase is perhaps the most important piece of information in the entire description. It was important, indeed, because it hinted at the goal of the nightmare, which also meant that Sunny, Nephi's, and the other members of the cohort would have to succeed where the ancient sovereign and his army had failed. Great! Sunny felt a bit of dread at the prospect, but at the same time, he also felt a little relieved. At least he knew now they wouldn't really need to search for the mystical estuary of the great river in order to return to the waking world. They just had to kill something that even a sovereign had not been able to kill. He was going to have to discuss this with Nephi's. In the meantime, though, he still hadn't learned what his new, shiny supreme memory could do. Looking back to the shimmering runes, he read, Memory Enchantments, Legacy of Twilight, King's Resentment, Royal Promise. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.